So you walk into a room. What kind of room is it? Is it a bedroom, living room, dining room? Is it a garage? Is it an armory? Is it a throne room, a torture chamber, a storage room, a janitor closet, a cafeteria? All these single words can really evoke a lot of imagination from players. And by players, I mean the people playing characters and the people running games. So how can you take the burden off of yourself if you're running a game, or even when you're playing as a character, by just letting one word or the words you're using contain a lot of information? And that's really what this video is about. So let's take a look at something I've lately been referring to as container words. You've landed at Stochastic Agency. In this video, I'm going to ask you to stretch your imagination to talk about one of the most common tools we use in tabletop role-playing games: words. More specifically, I've started to consider and referring to some of these words as containers. So how's your vocabulary? Words like sanctuary, fortress, or workshop are more powerful than you think. They frame your expectations, guide decisions, and shape the world you're playing in. Why? Because they contain a lot more information than you think. So let's take a look at how you can use them to expand and build on the tabletop role-playing experience you want to have, whether you're a GM or a player. Using the concept of container words effectively in tabletop role-playing games can streamline narration, lead to an enhanced improvisation, and create richer engagement without excessive exposition. By leaning into the implied details these words contain, GMs and players can make faster, more immersive choices while creating enough openness for collaborative play. Context in role-playing games is fluid. It shifts based on mechanics, narrative framing, player expectations, and emergent play. Container words can anchor this fluidity, shaping how information is understood at any given moment. Container words are context dependent. The meaning of a container word isn't fixed. It shifts based on its surrounding context. The word sanctuary shifts its meaning and context depending on the game you're playing in. Players might assume it's a holy place in a fantasy setting, offering protection and the potential for a divine presence. In a horror game, it could imply temporary safety, but with the underlying threat that safety is not going to last. In a post-apocalyptic game, it might suggest a fortified refuge, possibly controlled by another faction. The same word shapes expectations differently depending on the game's tone, mechanics, and stakes. Container words shape the flow of play. When a GM or a player uses a container word, it subtly guides the group's interaction and intentions throughout the scene. The Hall of Kings versus the throne room. The Hall of Kings in some ways suggests history, legacy, grandeur. Players might be studying tapestries, or they're there to search for lore. Throne room implies immediacy, politics, confrontation. Players might prepare to negotiate or face a ruler. If the GM had simply said a large chamber, the statement lacks straightforward narrative or mechanical framing. So what does a container word like kitchen imply? Well, it's a physical space. It's usually indoors, part of a home or a restaurant. It serves a function, a place where food is prepared. There are sensory details that are present, like the smell of cooking, the clutter of utensils, and the warmth of the stove. There are objects already in this room, like knives, pans, the sink, and, of course, the oven. Potential interactions are already possible, like cleaning, cooking, eating, and just gathering. You don't need to describe these elements outright. The word kitchen already contains them. So by choosing specific container words, the scene is already framed before actions are taken. These words imply description because they are powerful, and they create instant mental imagery with minimal effort. They establish shared expectations between the players. They set the stage for interactions without listing every detail. So let's break down a few other words and how they function in play. Location-based container words. Some words just imply environments without extra description, like kitchen mentioned before. A dungeon is going to imply darkness, stone corridors, the possibility of traps, and monsters. The throne room can imply grandeur, a ruler, political intrigue. A marketplace implies crowds, noise, trade, and pickpocketing. The shopping mall implies crowds, stores, money, the food court, and the back room for all the mall employees. Certain container words will reinforce themes without needing that additional exposition. In Blades in the Dark, words like heist, crew, and heat reinforce a criminal underworld setting. In a Dark Souls-inspired RPG, words like hollow, bonfire, and cursed could imply melancholy, decay, and the cycles of rebirth. Dungeon and quest signal a structure for challenge, reward, and exploration in D&D. You can effortlessly maintain tone and consistency with these words because of their embedded themes. Set the scene quickly. When describing a new location or an NPC or a situation, you don't need to provide every sensory detail. Just drop the right container word and let the player's minds fill in the rest. How about that most beloved of starting points for every fantasy game? You meet in a tavern. How much do you really need to say? Well, you could say, the wooden floor tavern is dimly lit with a long bar, scattered tables, a roaring fireplace, and the smell of stale ale. Or just say, the tavern is lively. Either one works, depending on how you play, because the word tavern already contains implied meaning. What's here? The bar, the table, the fireplace, the bartender, the patrons. What's going on? Drinking, socializing, bar fights, rumors. What can the players do? Gamble, eavesdrop, find a job, and get into trouble. Do players need to ask for details? Not necessarily. You can just let them provide them based on the word tavern. Background-based container words. Specific descriptors can carry implicit personality, status, behavior, and loads of games already do this, and they have them in place. Rather than overloading descriptions, they use a single evocative word that lets it imply the rest. The knight suggests armor, duty, chivalry, and a code of honor. A beggar implies poverty, desperation, interaction with charity, and possibly indifference. The wizard invokes robes, books, arcane knowledge, and mystery. If you say a merchant approaches, the players may already be imagining clothing like fine robes or rugged traveling gear. Personality-wise, they could be talkative or shrewd, eager to sell. And we already know what the possible interactions are. Haggling, deception, the offering of rare goods, without adding additional adjectives or anything else to shape the expectation of appearance, behavior, and the NPC's role in the world. Container words and actions. These words don't just describe places. They also suggest possible actions. Players immediately intuit what they can do when they hear these words. Instead of rigidly defining every action, you can let players use broad, descriptive words that provide a lot of flexibility when they do execute actions. Crime scene. There's a lot to investigate and uncover in that set of words, right? But how are you playing the game? We know that words like investigate and search will come up. So do you role play them out, or do you role play them out? One approach says, I investigate the crime scene. It already frames an entire set of actions and movement around the scene without needing to say, I look for footprints. I check the walls for hidden compartments. I study the blood spatter. While the other approach asks the players to say everything to show the actions to take in place and the movement within the scene. Some verbs also act as descriptive containers by carrying implied meaning. Sneak is creeping and avoiding notice, with the possibility of consequences for if you get detected. Bargain implies negotiation, the possibility of haggling, risk versus reward. Command carries authority, the expectation of obedience, with the potential for resistance. Each of these words suggests a full scene without extra exposition. Now, all the players can use container words to shape their actions in the context, and there's a lot of implied meaning when making choices to use certain words. Well, they can speed up play, enhance immersion like we said before. In a workshop, players might assume tools and materials are already available. They may also assume someone works here, leading them to seek out the NPC without being prompted. By trusting the implied meaning in container words, players can make decisions faster and engage more naturally with the world. Expectations for engagement. A GM can create strong emotional responses by intentionally playing with container words. Once a word is spoken, players are immediately going to start processing it through their assumptions, genre knowledge, and the group's playstyle. This can create expectations that drive engagement or cause friction if the implied meaning doesn't match the game's reality. Subverting expectations can alter the tone and mood by twisting its implied meaning. The tavern is empty, with a single bartender who doesn't speak. Every book is blank in this library. These both force the players to reconsider what is the purpose of this. On the other hand, reinforcing expectations for immersion makes the world feel cohesive and lived in. The temple, where the air smells of incense and whispers echo off walls and acolytes walk around silently in robes, all support the implied meaning. By playing into or against expectations, both players and GMs shape the experience dynamically. Certain words subtly will change how players interact without telling them to do so. Fortress versus mansion. Now, fortress suggests defense, soldiers, and strategy, so there's a good chance that combat and tactics may be used here. A mansion suggests luxury, the possibility of secrets, and social influence. Will there be intrigue and deception? If a player assumes something based on the word alone, like fortress, and they say, well, there must be guards present, right? Just roll with it, even if you didn't plan for that. However, when these expectations are broken too often, players might feel disconnected from the setting. So players may feel misled if that fortress turns out to be an unguarded, crumbled, and more like an abandoned house. This is why some precision is important and does matter. It ensures that the player's mental model aligns with the game's reality. Misaligned container words can cause play friction. If the GM or the system uses a container word in a way that doesn't match player expectations, it can cause confusion or frustration. Bizarre. Now, that word has some connotation to it. Players may be expecting a sprawling, lively marketplace filled with people, stalls, and exotic goods. If the GM instead describes a single vendor on an empty street, the word bizarre kind of clashes a little with that one-word description. Players might pause for clarification. Wait, is this actually a bazaar? Which breaks immersion. This shows why choosing specific words that do align with the intended experience is important for maintaining engagement. If a player names a location in broad terms, just make it real. If they say, we head to the blacksmith's forge, treat it as established, even if you didn't plan on having one. Making the most of your vocabulary. Container words shortcut communication and shape the scenes themselves. So use broad words to keep actions flexible instead of over-explaining actions. You can use container words that suggest multiple options. I searched the workshop for anything useful. This allows the GM to offer multiple possibilities, tools, notes, weapons, while something like, I look for a wrench on the left side of the room, checking under the table, kind of limits and forces the potential for unnecessary rolls or additional clarification. In other words, start broad first and narrow if you need to. So be intentional. A single word can shape how players perceive a scene. So when you choose words that reinforce the tone, stakes, and actions you want to encourage, it gives you the ability to introduce locations and NPCs before you even need to ask. So when you do need to ask, think about, does this align with the context and tone I want? Does this create the right assumptions for the players to act on? If your game emphasizes a particular type of play, use container words that reinforce it. In a combat-heavy game, calling the location a battlefield instead of just a field implies tactical positioning, environmental hazards.
A socially focused game using the word ballroom instead of hall tells the players that they might expect intrigue, the possibilities for hidden alliances, and the use of etiquette. In an exploration game, ruins implies mystery, history, and the potential for danger. A settlement, people, trade, possible side quests. Think about game verbs. What action does the system use? Choose words that imply those actions. If the players react strongly to a subverted container, you can use it to guide the session. Even if they fixate on the unusual thing, make it important. If they misinterpret something, clarify with detail or just lead into the misunderstanding. Let players fill in details rather than overloading with description. Draw from their natural assumptions and fill in the gaps. When players introduce their own descriptive container words, it helps to collaboratively build the world. Why this matters in play. The introduction of locations, NPCs, factions, are all going to depend on the words you choose to use to describe them. It can make the game world richer. If something feels off, quick questions can either clarify or interrupt what's happening, right? Instead of the game getting bogged down in over-description, trust container words to carry their weight. They create efficient narration through implied description. You don't need to over-explain. This can encourage player agency by getting them to act on the inferred details, thus enhancing improvisation. When you throw out words like alleyway or guild hall, you can trust that the players will find the gaps in description. Their implied description does most of the work, however, allowing for faster engagement and narration, with player agency helping to shape the world. More fluid improvisation that builds off assumptions instead of rigid details is done by treating words like castle, sorcerer, battlefield as preloaded with meaning. You free up the mental space to adjust for any new details, to enhance decision making, and to encourage role-playing rather than exhaustive exposition. This sets the stage before even shaping any expectations. They interact with mechanics and narrative themes by reinforcing their tone of play. They guide player decisions, sometimes without them even realizing it. But when misused, they create friction. By recognizing that word choice affects player interpretation, we can improve the flow of role-playing conversations, refine improvisation, and strengthen narrative clarity. And that's about it for this confusing word salad, right? Like, dislike, and subscribe at your own discretion. But take a moment to stop and think about the words you choose to use and how they help you have a well-played game.